All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us again today. We really do appreciate your patience yesterday with our stumble. I'm not sure what all the trouble we were running into, but I believe that it was a pause in our journey that maybe was necessary, and I'm sure that we will have an even better session with Anita today for it. My name is Jackie with Safe and Civil, and I'm here just to kind of help out. A couple housekeeping things. If you have questions, please submit them anytime in the chat box on the right side of the screen. We'll keep track of them and check back with Anita at the end of the session to answer those questions. If there's time and if she can't respond to all of them, she will be ready to include those in the next webinar. If you have technical difficulties, you can also send a message to myself as the host in the chat box, and we'll do our best to help you with any of those. And as always, we are recording the webinar, so we will send a link out to you in a couple days' time so that you can revisit this if you didn't get the opportunity to stick with us all the way through today. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Anita, and we'll get started.
Welcome, and I so appreciate all of you who were with me yesterday or with me today, and happy Valentine's Day. This evening I'm having a party, so I am sitting in my kitchen at home. I have my Valentine's tree here, and actually, I forgot to bring this over. For those people who are in very, very stormy places like the East Coast this evening, here are the flowers from my garden because it's turning spring in the Pacific Northwest, and my witch hazel is all in bloom. So we greet you on as we enter spring and you don't. Valentine's Day as a teacher was my favorite day. I loved getting Valentines. I loved giving Valentines. I loved the joy of the children. So, and even though we canceled yesterday, I got 4 additional questions for today, so we're going to make this as rich as we can. And so you have the PowerPoint, and we're also going to put up, because of so many requests, a number of very, very good articles on the whole question about close reading and complex text and comprehension and informational text. So I have searched for great articles that you can read. So yes, it is February 14th, our third, but not final, our third webinar of the year. We're going to have this as what we're going to cover. One, we had looked at close reading last webinar, and a lot of questions came in. So we're going to follow up on those questions, and then also look at complex text, particularly the research in terms of primary grades versus upper grades. The whole question, should we front load or not? And then a question, if we talked about informational text, what should we do in terms of informational read-alouds? So we have lots to cover, as always, in this hour, and so be ready to participate. I might ask you to say things together. I might ask you to whisper something to a partner if you're there with a partner. If not, just talk to yourself, which we all do quite often. So this is our agenda. And first, last time we looked at close reading, and particularly how could close reading of informational text be implemented in the context of explicit instruction. And so we looked at the definition of close reading as well as looked at different ways that we could really address it using questions as well as strategies. So close reading, I'm going to read when I stop, you say the next word, so we're all alive today. Close reading refers to the careful and systematic analysis of a text for a particular purpose. Now, to me, this is absolutely a critical definition because it is always for a purpose. For example, I got all these emails after last time saying, can you give us more idea about close reading? So I downloaded articles, and I closely read all of these articles, but I had a purpose. In fact, I even wrote down the purposes before I started. And so back here I wrote down questions. What is close reading? How is it applied to narrative, informative, and argument? So I wrote down what my purposes were in reading the articles. But you know, another thing comes to mind as I read those articles, and that is the purpose for close reading should be matched to the purpose of the author. And so if the author is writing an argument and they are meant to convince me of something, then my purpose would be to determine what was the claim of that author and how did they support it. If an author wrote purely to entertain myself, but it was fairly complex text in terms of the language that was used, then not only would I want to have as my purpose to enjoy the story, but I would also have as a purpose, how did the author intentionally get me engaged in it? So I am looking at it today as what is the author's purpose, what is my purpose in relationship to it. Well, we looked last time at close reading, and here were some questions that you sent to me. First of all, one of the questions was, should you always do close reading? When should you do it, and when should you not? Well, I think this is a very good question because I'm reminded of just an everyday existence and how sometimes you close read things, like my reading of these articles certainly was meant to be close. But when I read a novel, when I read the newspaper, when I read through recipes to determine what I'm going to have for my party this evening, which will be very delicious. You know, in some cases, I'm going to scan it. I'm going to skim for the information. I'm not going to do close reading all the time. And I think that is important to remember. One of the articles I'm going to put online, I think was a particularly useful article by Snow. And it was done for International Reading Association as a review of potential challenges as well as benefits of close reading. They made a very important point that we don't want to overdo close reading. Everything does not have to be read closely. Even a story in a core reading program does not always deserve close reading. Maybe our purpose is just to get the plot, to get the action, to get what that is occurring. And then sometimes the goal is to go a step further and find out, well, what was the author's intent in writing the story? And what was the message, if there was one? So to me, when I ask the question, when, well, only if the material is complex would I need to do really, really close reading. If it's an easy read, then I won't have to do close reading. So, but here was the next question. How does close reading differ from informational text to narrative text to an argument? And I do think that we have to look at these differently. For example, if I'm reading a short story, I'm going to read it to get the plot. And as I'm working with students, I might ask questions such as, who is the main character and how do you know that they're the most important character? What is the setting of the story and how is that significant? What were some of the events and what did it lead to? So I'm going to ask questions that ensure comprehension of the story, following the plot, the main character, being certain that they know the challenge or problem of the character and how they attempted to resolve it. So I'm going to ask questions that have my goal and the student's goal of understanding the story. And then we might go back and look at just a part of it. We might go back and say, now, we've read the story, we've enjoyed the story, we know we can retell the story, and now we're going to go back and just look at the word choice of the author in paragraph number 4 to describe the main character. And then we might really closely look at that paragraph. But our first goal would be reading it and utilizing all we know from story grammar to understand that. And then we might go back and hone in on symbolism or the craft or the word usage. But not for the whole thing. That's not how we read narratives. Now, informational text. Last time we looked at a variety of strategies, starting with a big overlapping strategy is you have a purpose, and it is to get information because the purpose of informational text is to inform. The author wrote it to have us inform. So we might read a paragraph, we might stop, and somehow we're going to rehearse the information. We might read, stop, and respond to teachers' questions. We might read, stop, and answer our own questions. We might read, stop, and respond by going back and circling the, if we could write on the text, circling the topic, underlining the most critical information. And all that time, our purpose is to gather up the information that we need in that subject area. And then we might go back and just look at how the author organized it, which would be an act of close reading. So we might go back and say, how did the author organize it to start with global information, going to specific, giving an example, and then going, and so that the students would have some insight into the type of organization. Now let's look at argument. And so we're reading an argument, and we might ask questions of the students such as, what is the author's claim? And what is their first reason for that claim, and how did they support it? What was the next reason for that claim, and how did they support it? And what was the next reason for that claim, and how did they support it? And what did the author do in the conclusion? Because the purpose of an argument is the author's purpose should match our purpose, which is determining what is the claim of the author and how, what reasons do they use and how do they support it. But then we might go back and look at which arguments have the best support and which are the weakest, or how did the author organize these reasons? Did they organize it from the strength to the weakest argument, or the other way around? So it does differ, but I think if we just keep in mind that we might be rereading it, we might be rereading a portion of it, but it has a definite purpose. But it's not the only purpose. And I think that is why I so appreciated the Snow article, because sometimes the purpose in narrative is to get the plot. And what we've done in the past is ask story grammar questions, which is still a very good idea. And informative is to get information, which we might use a strategy like taking notes or writing down a question for the heading and responding. And an argument is to get what is the claim and how is it supported. But then we might go back with a more precise purpose for a small amount of the context that we look at. Well, now this brings me to a question that Anne Watanabe asked, and she said, what is the difference between retell, recount, and summarize? So I had to investigate. I had to read as many explanations as I could to capture this, because in the K1 standards, when they talk about narrative, they talk about retell. Then in grades 2 and 3, they use the term recount, and starting in 4th grade, they use the term summarize. So this is sort of my understanding at the moment. That retell, first of all, which is used in kindergarten and 1st grade, is where you orally retell the events. And it's a little less formal, and you're going to say, well, this is what happened at the beginning of the story, then this happened, and this happened. And it's done in a telling fashion, in an oral fashion. Recount is one where you're telling about the events, and you might do it in written form or a verbal form. and it is going to be very clearly done in chronological order. So I recount what I did on my trip. It could be about a personal event, or I recount what happened in this narrative, and I do it in chronological order, and it's written or it's oral, and there's a little more precision to it. And summarize, starting in 4th grade, means that you condense it. You're not telling every single thing. You're condensing it, telling the most important idea and the critical events and the critical details. But you're condensing it and making some judgments about what's going to be most critical to convey. And it could be done in written or in narrative form. Sometimes as I read all these articles, I thought, well, you know, this is a little wordsmithing where particularly retell and recount are not consistently utilized. And so both of them retell the story, one orally, one could be in writing, one less formal, one more formal, one that gives a basic idea of what occurred in events, but recount is a little more precise. So I would love, Anne, for you to follow up on it and let me know what you think. Well, those are some of the questions that I had, except the next one is, what is complex text, and should all text be complex? So, you know, this is what we're all grappling with, and, we just don't want to go down a path that might take us in a way that would not be beneficial to children. So I think this is one that we really have to answer. So first I looked through many articles on complex text. And here were how they define them. So features of complex text. Multiple themes. The next one's really important. Dense information. So I'm reading something that's complex and it's very dense. There's a lack of repetition. It doesn't go back over ideas. And the settings or topics may be unfamiliar, making it more difficult because I have less background knowledge on it. And the sentences are longer and more complex. The vocabulary may be not as common, and there is a lack of review and putting things together, and the paragraphs get longer. I had to laugh because when I looked at these, it reminded me of a list of attributes that led to unfriendly text, where it's very dense, lots of unfamiliar words, long sentences, long paragraphs, no review, no repetition, sort of what we were asking publishers to move away from to have more friendly text. But complex text is the point at which we might definitely want to do some close reading because it's going to be more difficult. Even as I read that snow article, I had to keep rereading and thinking about it and taking notes on it and underlining and putting in margin notes just because the way in which it was written definitely is complex. And so the questions were, first of all, should all of the text be complex? Now, I want to, first of all, make a little bit of clarity here because I think that Hebert had an excellent review of research and their own studies on the primary grades in terms of text complexity. Because the argument for text complexity, more complex text, is that our books have gone downhill and that they're significantly less complex today than they once were. Well, so they examined books that were written in 2nd and 3rd grade. And they simply found that in those grades, 2nd and 3rd grade, that there had not been a decline in the complexity of the text. In fact, they are first found no research that found increasing the complexity of text in 2nd, 3rd grade would benefit future reading. In fact, they suggest that accelerating text complexity is actually risky. I understand that. because then the students who are just gaining in their reading skills are going to have less ease of getting the information. And the words are going to be more difficult, the sentences are going to be more difficult, the paragraphs are going to be longer. And if I'm just learning something, then I need to have it so that I'm going to be successful. And forgive me, I am home, so I was practicing my cello this morning, and I picked a piece that definitely had musical text complexity. Not only was the rhythm difficult, but the movement from string to string was really complex, and I could feel myself saying, ew, as a beginning cellist, which I still am, ew, I just don't want to play this. I just don't want to do it. I'm going to put my cello away, which is exactly what occurred. And I got to feel what it is when you have not the skills at that moment to do it, how it feels. It wasn't that I was motivated by the challenge. No, not one bit. And so I think that we have to be careful, and particularly in the primary grades. The text that we currently have in our core reading programs and in our science and our social studies are adequately complex without significantly increasing the complexity. The argue comes about mostly in fourth grade and above. And so we do know that the material for upper grades has declined in complexity over the last 50 years. And going back to 1962. And the cognitive demands are not as high in some of our materials. And often this occurred because we had a range of students in terms of their learning ability, their reading skills, and their writing, and so we reduced the complexity of the text to better serve those students. But the end result is that they didn't have experience with it. So we know that the ability to read complex, challenging text is going to predict when students are out of our secondary schools onto university, it's going to predict how well they do. And so we want them to have exposure to it. But let us not believe that every single thing has to be complex. And that's simply not going to be true of our students' life as adults or of their school life. That some things could be read with ease for the purpose of gathering information. It doesn't have to be always complex. It is very feasible to read a novel that carries you through, and you are very, very in touch with it in terms of the plot, and it doesn't have a lot of deep complexity. Let's have a balance here. And I think, I'm working a lot with middle school and high school kids, and a lot of them challenged in terms of their reading skills. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, let us have a balance. Let us have a variety of texts, of which, for informational text, but also for narrative and argument, that a lot of it is right on grade level. And then have some challenging, more complex text. But it's a balance here. And every time we swing, and that's what I see happening, is a swing that is not supported by a good deal of research. I've not been able to locate a lot of research that says, oh, have 100% of it be more complex text and the students will learn and they will be thrilled about it. I just haven't found that. So let us not swing too deeply. Let us have some more complex text, but let it be very balanced with things that are appropriate to our students. Well, I'm sure you have more questions on this, and I'm going to put up articles, so maybe we can have a discussion about it. Well, the next one, I think, is some of the biggest issues in Common Core in terms of comprehension. And that is, should we front-load the reading of complex text, or should the students read it cold? Those are your questions. Well, here is where I see us perhaps going off course and leaving all of the research that we have in terms of reading comprehension. When people say, no, don't give them background knowledge, don't give them vocabulary, have them just struggle with it. You know, I am very concerned about this, and I think we have to put this in perspective with research, that we cannot just leave what we know from so many stories, particularly when we look at struggling students and why do they have difficulty with text? No background knowledge, no vocabulary, or limited background knowledge, limited vocabulary. So isn't our job to support them? Now, I understand the whole concept of that we may have so overdone front-loading that there was no reason to read the material. So I think we can get a middle position here where we say, yes, we're going to look at the text and say, for this text, what will be useful for the students to know? What vocabulary is useful for the students to know? But it's not so much that there is no need to read it. And I think that's the point where we have to go. But saying that complex text should be read coldly, I think, is a problem. You know, sometimes when I read the articles that say don't front load at all, I think they're coming from a position of looking at through adult eyes of where all of us have gathered so much background knowledge and vocabulary. Now, I'm 67 years old. I had 67 years to gain background knowledge, to gain vocabulary. So for most things, I can read it and make some gains in it. But we're talking 9-year-olds, we're talking 10-year-olds, we're even talking 15-year-olds who haven't had that gift of years of reading, years of study, years of going to university and gathering up background knowledge. So let's not go overboard here. Let us make it a decision based on the text that we are reading. So let's look at front-loading, because we usually look at it in terms of vocabulary and background knowledge. And so if I want you to be able to read it, I'm going to ask myself, what vocabulary do you perhaps not have but need for this passage? What kind of background knowledge do you need? And if it's informational text, we're going to preview it. We're going to look at the headings and subheadings within it. We're going to look at the graphics. We're going to get an idea to support our comprehension. So, but let's use research. See, that's what I see us doing, is walking away from a huge body of research. So let's just look at some of the findings that we have. So I'm going to read. When I stop, you say the next word. Indeed, one of the most endearing findings in reading research is the extent to which students' vocabulary knowledge relates to their reading comprehension. So we know that the vocabulary that you possess, that you have able to obtain from permanent memory, is very related to your reading comprehension. And we have many studies on this. And so Marzano wrote a book about vocabulary and said, direct vocabulary instruction has an impressive track record of improving students' background, knowledge, and comprehension of academic content. And this is a person who does close reading of many, many studies and concluded that teaching kids vocabulary is going to improve their background knowledge, which many of our students lack, and their comprehension of academic content. We don't want to so overdo it that all the words are taught and you don't have to think about any of the meanings as you read. But those critical words, we're going to teach. The late Steve Stahl did an impressive study that found with an effect size, look at that effect size, 0.97, that direct teaching of vocabulary made a significant difference in attainment of related content. vocabulary. And now I might be more selective in terms of the amount of time. For example, recently I was working in a fourth grade class. They're reading about natural resources. Now, I introduced that term, natural resources, things found in nature that are valuable to people, and I gave some examples, but I didn't make it as extensive as I might have done because there were 4 pages in the chapter about natural resources. So I introduced it, but allowed the students to expand their knowledge of it as they read the text. Well, let's look at background knowledge. You know, I'm just constantly amazed at how much background knowledge children gather up through life, from all the experiences that they have, from all the reading that they do, from all that we teach them. We get background knowledge, but it is progressive. And so at 67, I have a lot more background knowledge than I did at 10. And this is a truth that we must recognize. So background knowledge. Let's just look at the research on why we might not want to say, let's go totally cold. So I'm going to read, when I stop, say the next word. Background knowledge of text has a major impact on whether or not a reader can comprehend text. Okay? So my background knowledge is going to make a difference in terms of my comprehension. So if I am reading these articles, for which I have a huge amount of background knowledge on research and reading, you know, there wasn't an article in here that I did not have adequate background knowledge. But if I was reading a book about engineering, if I was reading a book about advanced medical responses, if I was reading a book, you know, about how to build the shuttle, you know, I don't have enough background knowledge to comprehend that. So it is very specific as to the individual, what they have learned over time. Let's look at the next summary of findings. Across grades and reading ability, prior knowledge of subject area and key vocabulary results in higher scores on reading comprehension measures. So across grades and reading ability, my prior knowledge of the subject and my vocabulary is going to result in higher scores on comprehension measures. Well, that's how knowledge is predictive of my comprehension. Well, to me, this is exactly the challenge for many of you, with the students that you're working with in your district, and students who lack sufficient background knowledge or are unable to activate it may struggle to access, participate, and progress through the general curriculum. So I lack background knowledge. You know, I am going to have difficulty with general curriculum. Hey, for this situation, I need to give some background knowledge in order to support students' understanding and their access to the curriculum. So I have many examples of teaching background knowledge, but let's just take a moment, and I want you to read this to yourself. And as you do it, I want you to tell yourself what it means. So everybody reading this paragraph, and tell yourself how you would interpret it. I don't know about you, got a little gist out of that, but I simply don't have enough background knowledge. Now, some of my friends in the medical field, my good friends that are physicians, my own physician, probably could say, oh, sure, I can tell you just exactly what this means. I don't have either the background knowledge or the vocabulary necessary. So I would need to have some front loading in order to access this. Well, so let me just give you an example. So I was teaching in 5th grade. The students were going to 4th or 5th grade recently, and the students were going to read an article about emperor penguins and how they differed from other birds, and particularly how they gave birth and cared for their young. And it required, the article really required you had some knowledge of the environment of Antarctica that the penguins lived in. And I said to myself, teaching in the heartland of our country, I think there is some possibility that not everybody has a lot of background knowledge. And so I taught them some background knowledge. And not only would it improve comprehension, but also it improves their knowledge. So by teaching background knowledge, I am not only increasing the probability they'll understand this passage at a deeper level, but they'll have knowledge that they could use in other situations. So you're going to be my students. Now, they have been studying environments. And so I actually started by having them think when they had studied different environments and different biomes, what did they talk about? And so I asked the students to think about it, and they came up with these. So you're my students. So every time we look at environment, then you suggested that we look at these 4 elements, that we look first at the land, right? And then we look at the climate, and then we look at the vegetation or the plants, and we also could look at the animals. So we're going to be reading a passage about a really interesting passage about emperor penguins, and we are going to learn about their life in Antarctica. But it really requires that first we have some knowledge about Antarctica. And so there we have a globe, which in the day I taught it, I had a globe, so I could show them where Antarctica was located. And it is twice the size of this continent, which is Australia, so it is very, very large. And the South Pole that we often hear about is located in Antarctica. So then I showed them on the map the South Pole. And so looking at that picture of Antarctica, most of it is covered in ice. So look at the first bullet. I'm going to read. When I stop, you say the next word. Ice covers all but 2.4% of land. Okay? Just a small amount of it is not covered in what, everyone? Ice. 90% of ice in the whole Earth is found in Antarctica. So we've already learned one major thing that certainly may affect the animals that live there or the plants that are there, is that it is covered in what, everyone? Ice and fat. 90% of ice found in all of Earth is found in what continent? Antarctica. Now, we're going to learn about the climate. Now, looking at the pictures, you can already make some very good guesses about it. So looking at this picture, do you believe that it is a cold or warm environment? Cold, okay? So the pictures would indicate that. So look at the first bullet. I'm going to read, and you read with me and go. Coldest place on Earth. Okay, so it's not Nebraska. It is, though this year I know it feels like it, it is not Kansas. It is not Michigan. The coldest place on Earth is the continent of Antarctica. And in in the winter, the temperature drops below a minus 73 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now 100 below, uh-oh, that is very, very cold. And read the third bullet with me, windiest place on Earth. So, we have a number of big ideas here about the climate. Think about it and tell your partner. And you said it's not the warmest, but the coldest, and it's also the windiest. So as we read about the emperor penguins, we're going to be thinking about that. Now, the next thing is going to surprise you. And so we've already learned the word precipitation. And so read the whole bullet with me and go. Precipitation, driest place on Earth. Well, what about all that snow? Isn't that precipitation? Well, look at the second one. My turn. Antarctica is considered a desert because very little rain or snow. But look at all that snow. Well, here's what happens. A little bit of snow, but it's so, so cold, the coldest place on Earth, 100 degrees Fahrenheit below in sometimes, that it doesn't melt. And so then the next time it snows, it adds another layer, and it doesn't melt. So that is hundreds of years of snow. But because it doesn't get a lot, it is actually considered a desert. Now, I want you to think of what you've learned about the climate of Antarctica. And in a moment, you're going to tell your partner what you've learned, and you're going to start by saying, these are some of the things I learned about the climate of Antarctica. But first, think about it. So once, you're going to tell your partner, and you're going to start by saying, some of the things I learned about the climate of Antarctica are, and sharing with your partner ones. You might call on someone, and they might say, some of the things I learned about the climate of Antarctica is that it is the coldest place on Earth, that it is very windy, that it is sometimes 100 degrees below zero in the winter, and it has very little precipitation, almost no rain or snow, so it's actually considered a desert. Now, there's some value in this, because now they've learned something. Maybe you learned something, and so they're getting background knowledge that will serve them well when we read the article and we ask ourselves, what are some of the challenges of animals living here? Well, some challenges you would not have known had you not learned about the climate. So background knowledge can support the comprehension of this article. It can support future articles and materials that we read, but also it is giving us general background knowledge about our world. And so the kids are learning from it. So to me, if we don't overdo it, I didn't teach you everything about emperor penguins. You still have to read and gain that information. But I facilitated it by giving you some background knowledge and teaching you some knowledge that you could use. I just see only value in it. It's not overdone. Well, and then we learned about the plants and the animals there. Before we read the story about emperor penguins, not a story, but an article. Well, now, here is a possibility in terms of the cold read with complex text. Let's add intelligence here. Let's add thoughtfulness. And so let me use an example. I was working with middle school students, and it seems that everywhere I teach demonstration lessons, I have had the great gift of teaching about our seventh president, Andrew Jackson. And so the chapter in the 8th grade social studies book had 3 segments. And for each of those, we front-loaded. We talked the critical background knowledge, We taught critical vocabulary like suffrage and tariff that the students needed to know for the chapter. And then we read the chapter carefully, employing strategies for informational text. And so we did that before the first one, and the second one, and the third one. But then we gave the students a complex text. This happened to be the inaugural address of Andrew Jackson. And they had a paper that they divided in half, and they read it to themselves. We didn't front load it. We didn't teach special vocabulary. But we actually did front load it because we had read all of those chapters about Andrew Jackson before we did this. So already they had been front loaded, but not specifically for this. And they had to go through and say, what did he say he was going to do, which would require very close, purposeful reading. And it matches the purpose of the author, Andrew Jackson, was to say what he intended to do. And then they had to say, did he do it or not, and utilize evidence from those three chapters. So there, we didn't just cold read everything, but we did cold read something that was new text, but we'd learned a lot in the background before we did that. So let me give you another example. So I was reading with students a novel, Number Your Stars, a World War II novel about a child. And afterwards, and we front-loaded each chapter with more information about World War II and about Germany and about Hitler and so forth, so they had background knowledge. And we gave them short biographies of a number of children during World War II in different roles that they read cold, but they already had all that background knowledge from our previous reading. Isn't that what you do in life? I pick up these articles and I can read it cold, but it's because I've had a long opportunity to gain background knowledge. So we're putting this in real context. Now I have some background knowledge. It doesn't have to be specifically given to me. I can then leap into this new reading. Well, I'd love your feedback on that take on it, but I think it's an intelligent, careful take. Well, in our remaining time, here was the last question that I received. How should we adjust our read-alouds and primary grades to match the Common Core state standards? Well, thank you for that question, and luckily it's one I've been delving into recently, and I really want to share my findings and encourage you perhaps to follow up on it. So one of the things that is emerging consistently in articles and in research is how useful it would be to increase the amount of informational text. Okay, we already are doing that in the upper grades in terms of reading, and we could also do that in terms of the read-alouds. More informational text. And a number of writers, including Susan Newman, said, well, let's even really get some background knowledge out of informational read-alouds by reading on a single topic, but more than one book. For example, I went down to my library of books, and these are some that I have on weather. So we could have like a weather theme. And, okay, here's one, it's snowing. Okay, this one is very appropriate for people in Hawaii who have no idea about snow. Here's one on the area of lightning, and this one is on tornadoes. This one is on hurricanes, and this book is on how weather works. So I'm not going to just read one book about weather. I'm going to read multiple books about weather so that the students gain really background knowledge, starting in kindergarten, preschool, kindergarten, first, second grade, that they could use later on. Well, one of the goals here is to give kids what Susan Newman refers to as knowledge networks. And knowledge about weather, knowledge about plants, knowledge about land, knowledge about, so that they gain these bodies of knowledge that they can use for later comprehension. And this has struck me as something that we need to systematically do, is have, again, a balance, but have use our read alouds, which we use in the primary grades to work on comprehension, and make a good deal of it, at least 50% of it informational text reading. Well, in this pursuit of information, I read many articles that talked about how many of our kids have very limited background knowledge and how we need to start working on it very, very early on. And I'm going to suggest a book that I read over the holidays, a short book, but a useful one, by Susan Newman and Tanya Wright, about basically read alouds in the primary grades, a book called All About Words. And it is a practical guide to use of read alouds, but it gives us so much information. It would be an excellent one for the primary teachers to have as a book study, preschool, kindergarten, first, second grade teachers. So let me just take you through a little bit on this and its thoughtfulness in terms of teaching background knowledge as well as vocabulary. And so the premise is that we can't wait to give kids knowledge when they start reading science and social studies books in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. We have to start really early on and build up these knowledge networks. And so this is what Newman and Wright suggest, that you pick a topic, and so maybe your topic is insects, maybe your topic is going to be weather, maybe your topic is different types of shapes, maybe your topic is, and you figure out the big ideas that you want kids to gain, and that you get books on the same topic. It could be a narrative that has information, but more importantly, informational text. And you decide what words you want them to gain from these books that you're going to teach, that they're going to practice, and that you're going to review. So when you get this book, if you look in the end of it, you're going to find that there are examples of this. So here's one example right from All About Words. So you're going to do a unit on insects, and here's what you want the kids to know at the end, big ideas. That insects are living organisms, that insects have 6 legs and 3 body segments. They have antennae that they use to smell and feel, and they live in certain habitats based on their needs, and they have ways of protecting themselves. So these are the big ideas that we want the kids to emerge with. And so we're going to constantly go back, no matter what we're reading about, to these big ideas. And then they even recommend books. And they started with a predictable book about an insect in this case, a fiction story about insects, and then an informational text that is narrative, and then informational text and informational text and informational text. So they're all about insects, though, and these are the goals. So, and then these students also would be learning vocabulary, and so they looked at those books and told you what insect words they wanted, what challenge words they want kids to learn, and supportive words. Don't you love this? I'm just thinking about, now they put it into a program that's not out yet, Words of the World WOW program, but it's not available yet. But I think that reading the book and looking at what's at the end, you really get the idea of this. And then we have lots of research to put with this, with reading informational text more, and maybe a number of books on the same topic. We know how to pick the text. So I'm going to read to you, maybe as a part of that insect unit, I'm going to read you the Ladybug book. So thrilling. And is it above the kids' current reading level? If I read this, which I did in a first grade, yeah. And are they going to learn vocabulary and concepts from it? Yes. Is it written in an informational text style? Yes. Is it accurate? Yes. That's important. I was reading one that said that in the winter, squirrels hibernate and sleep all winter. Well, I look out my house right here, and I see, even when we had snow, I see scurrying little squirrels, so I know that that's not true. So it should be accurate and well written and have graphics to go with it. So that's what I'm looking for in informational read aloud text. And I'm going to do performance reading and define words, give them a little explanation as we proceed. So, and I'm going to ask them questions. And it would depend on narrative. So, Anne, here's that retell. I'm going to have a retell if it was narrative, the events, and make predictions. If it's informational text, I'm going to have them recall the factual information, maybe label concepts, compare and contrast, summarize the types of actions we would take in informational text. So you get to be my first graders. So students, we have been reading many books about insects, and today we're going to read about another type, and I want you to look at the parts of the word, and as soon as you can read the word, put your thumb up to show me that you have it. Okay, and the first part is lady, and the next part is bugs, and the whole word is ladybugs. What is it? Ladybugs. And so here we have a ladybug on a plant. Raise your hand if you've ever seen in person a ladybug. Now, we would first go through and preview by looking at all of the headings. But I want to just read a little bit of it as I would with the students after we've previewed. Okay, and so you can see the text. And the title, once again, is what? Ladybugs. Now let's look at the picture of this ladybug. And maybe you've had one in your hand. And this part is pretty hard, okay? It's not soft, it's pretty hard. And we already know some things about it if it is an insect. So on your table, make with your fingers the number of feet legs that a ladybug would have. So 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 10, and put that up in the air. And how many legs, everyone? 6, okay. Then we also learned about how many parts does an insect have in their body. So now, on your table, I want you to form the number of parts that we would find on any insect. Okay, show me. 2, 3, excellent job, 3 parts. Well, let's see what we learn about them. Okay, ladybugs belong to the group of insects known as beetles. So there's a whole big group of insects that are called beetles, and one kind of beetle is a ladybug. Okay? Beetles have a hard pair of forewings that rest over their backs. So these are a hard pair of what are called forewings. Okay, now let's just look at that word. Here we have wings so that they can do what? They can fly, right? And fore means in front. So they have a hard pair of forewings that cover their backs. So I want you to put your hand over his. And we're going to pretend that that is the forewings of a beetle. In this case, what, everyone? A ladybug. All right. So we're going to read this and stop and ask questions and firm up information as we go. And so that the students are going to be very involved in the reading of this. But the big idea here is let's use this opportunity to teach the kids some facts, you know, and so many of our kids don't have parents that are saying, ooh, there is a ladybug. Let's talk about it. Let's Google it. Let's look at the parts of it. Let's count the number of legs it has. Let's see what it does. What does it eat? Oh, it eats aphid. That's why we want them in our gardens. Some children are constantly getting knowledge taught to them. So many of our kids aren't. So let's not wait. Let's start in preschool, kindergarten, first grade. And I really hope that some of you will follow up. I don't always recommend books. I do recommend really good ones, and this one is a really good one. Well, here we are at the end now. We have a few minutes, like very few, but if you have some questions. But our next webinar is on a Thursday, April 17th. And what I decided to do is give a title of a general topic, and then you can send me questions. But I already have a list of questions on foundations for writing and how we might teach them and how we might use explicit instruction to teach them, whether it's spelling or handwriting or sentence structure. And so send me those questions, and we'll address them next time. So, Jackie, I know our time is waning, but did we have any questions?
I don't see any coming in just yet, Anita, but we'll give people a moment or two.
Absolutely.
If you have questions, you can enter them in the chat box and send them to myself or Anita, and we will help get them answered.
So just a reminder, I'm going to send these articles to Jackie to post along with the PowerPoint, along with the PDF file, so you can access them. Because there just were some really good articles on close reading, particularly Read the Snow article, which puts this in very good perspective. And on Valentine's Day, may we just, one, love our profession and celebrate that we get to do this, and also carry deep passion for our subject and for our students. It is always a joy to look up at your names and see so many of you that I've worked with in the past, and so happy Valentine's Day to all of you. May you have as much fun as I'm going to have this evening at my party. Good night.
Thanks, Anita, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your taking your time out of this Friday, a busy Friday at schools, no less, and of course, just a busy holiday Friday. We will get that information and the articles out to you via email next week once Anita gets that information headed towards us. I hope you enjoy your weekend. Thanks again for hanging in there today, coming back after yesterday's snafus, and we will see you coming up in April.
Absolutely, with perfection in terms of audio and visual. Thank you, Jackie.
Anita, it looks like we've got a question that just trickled in. And the question is, how would you support close reading and complex text in Title I LAP struggling reader instructional groups?
Well, you know, immediately I say, well, be certain that the students can read so that there's even complex text or close reading possibilities. And so, I mean, I think that if we move away from teaching them how to read the words with automaticity, how to have fluency, how to figure out the meaning of words in using context clues, those very fundamental skills. If they have not mastered those, it's taking our eyes off the mark. You have to have all of those skills in order to do close reading. And so if you're teaching the kids decoding, if you are teaching them how to read with automaticity, if you are teaching them fundamental ways to figure out vocabulary. If you're working on literal comprehension so that they have general understanding and key detail, you're getting them prepared for complex text. But if we go to complex text and don't do that foundation, it's just like if I was to get a very hard piece of cello music and no longer practice scales, no longer work on fingerings, no longer work on how I hold my bow, then there would be no the same thing is that we must use what we know from all of the research on Tier 2 and Tier 3 students and not waver off of it in terms of what's going to make a difference. And our last question. Have that
I think that's
email me and we'll continue that discussion.
It looks like that's all we have.
All right. Well, thanks, Jackie. We'll see you in April. Have a very good Valentine's Day.
Thanks, Anita. Thanks, one and all. Have a great holiday weekend.